Okay, and finally for today's activity, we have step 4. How does the conflict of the scene develop the theme of cruelty? All right, this will be our third body paragraph where we are answering this question. All right, again, focusing simply on conflict this time. All right, this will end up being your third body paragraph and your fourth body paragraph overall. So, the first thing we need to do is identify the main conflict in this scene. Is it man versus self, man versus man versus society, and man versus nature? Now, we don't have a lot of man versus nature at all in To Kill a Mockingbird, so chances are you're not man versus nature, so you're going to be looking at one of these three things. That's not to say it can't be man versus nature, but for the most part, you'll probably be focusing on man versus self, man versus man, or man versus society. In my example, and from Marigold's, we are going to be looking at man versus man. So that's the one I'm going to highlight. You're going to want to circle that on your worksheet. So number 1, it's asking you to explain your previous answer. So I want to explain how the conflict in my story is man versus man, which I do by saying that Elizabeth tears up Miss Lottie's flowers. Okay, so it's Elizabeth versus Miss Lottie. Number 2, how does the conflict in this scene relate to the cruelty that people show one another? So in Marigold, I explain that as Elizabeth destroys the flowers to make herself feel better, even though they are even though they are the only thing that Miss Lottie loves. Okay, proper grammar is important, right? So Elizabeth destroys the flowers to make herself feel better, even though they are the only things that Miss Lottie loves. Number 3, how does the conflict in this scene relate to prejudice? So we need to think prejudice is such a huge part of To Kill a Mockingbird. All right, how is a character or multiple characters not putting themselves in someone else's shoes? How are they making judgments about people, and how are those judgments affecting the way they treat them? All right, in my story, in my scene, the kids all judge Miss Lottie as a crabby old lady who is fun to annoy, but do not think of her as someone who is trying her best to brighten the dim, dirty shanty town for everybody. Even though Miss Lottie is old and crabby, she's doing everybody a nice thing, or a nice thing for everybody, in that she plants these beautiful flowers to brighten up their otherwise depressing state. All right. Number 4, explain the viewpoint of one side of the conflict. All right, so now I'm looking at number 3, and I'm going to tear it into 2 sides. Okay, I'm going to show Miss Lottie's side, and I'm going to show Elizabeth's side. So here, reveal my answer. We'll start with Elizabeth's side. Elizabeth hates the flowers because they are beautiful, and she likes to annoy Miss Lottie. Number 5, explain the viewpoint of the other side of the conflict. So I did Elizabeth first, so now I need to talk about Miss Lottie. Miss Lottie puts her heart and soul into making her flowers as beautiful as possible. Number 6, is the conflict resolved in this scene, or does it continue later on into the book? Explain. So mine's a short story, so mine's a little bit different, but this scene occurs at the end of the story. Miss Lottie and Elizabeth never resolve their differences. But Elizabeth does learn from her experience. Okay? So altogether, this scene occurs at the end of the story. Miss Lottie and Elizabeth never resolve their differences, but Elizabeth does learn from her experience. Now, in To Kill a Mockingbird, you need to think about how your scene affects the rest of the story. All right. Chances are your scene has an effect on some other part of the story that you need to consider. All right. Let me move this down to make it a little bit easier to see. Oops. And it's gone. And it's back. There we go. Sorry about that. And number 7. Is the conflict ironic in any way? If so, explain how. Now, there is irony present in To Kill a Mockingbird, and you need to think about that before you answer. Remember, irony is when something happens that is different than what you would normally expect to happen. Okay? Think long and hard about this before you write your answer. Now, for my story, it is a simple no. Okay? When it appears. All right? There is no irony to this situation. But again, you may want to get your teacher's opinion if you're unsure about the irony in your conflict. All right? And that wraps it up for the day. At this point, you should have all 4 steps filled in completely, and you should be ready to write your body paragraphs.